This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
My book is on the phenomenon of racial passing, which is the practice by which light-skinned African Americans passed as white. So I'm looking at people who looked white and made a deliberate decision to live as white. And the inspiration for this book came from a story that my aunt told me about a distant relative of ours who also ended up passing as white. And this story really haunted me, and it really would not leave me alone. So I spent about 10 years trying to document this history and trying to see if I could uncover the history of passing. This is what sort of set this project in motion. So I thought I might just start with that story, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the key arguments and themes of my book. So here's the story. On a sizzling summer morning in the late 1930s, a young girl waited on the curb of South Park Boulevard on Chicago's South Side for the Bud Billiken parade to begin. The heat was relentless, but on the second Saturday in August, it made no difference to children who leapt from their beds in search of the best spot to view the parade. The young girl joined a crowd that numbered in the thousands, and she cheered as drum majors, baton twirlers, and celebrities in convertibles passed by. She ran out to the floats to touch the parade's anointed king and queen and caught the candy that the participants tossed to her. Beginning in 1929 as a celebration of the Chicago Defenders Newsboys, the Bud Billiken Parade later became a back-to-school celebration that honored all Black children on the South Side. Known as the God of all things as the way they should be, Bud Billiken was a mythical character that showered Black children with affection. The parade was a South Side institution at a time when racial tensions ran high, when Black families squeezed into overcrowded kitchenettes, and when Black children knew not to venture beyond the boundaries of the Black Belt. The Bud Billiken Parade evoked a deep sense of race pride, community, and togetherness. For one day a year, Black children could imagine that the city of Chicago was all theirs. The young girl could not have known that this would be her last time hearing the marching bands and the cheering crowds and following the parade to the picnic in Washington Park. Unlike many Black parents, she would not share this experience with her children. She looked white, as did both of her parents. At the insistence of her mother, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman apart from her family. It was not her choice. She pleaded with her mother. She did not want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life that she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received an inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she called to tell her that her father was dying and that she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side. The young girl who had once sat on a curb in Chicago's most historic Black neighborhood to watch America's largest Black parade was a white woman now, and there was simply no turning back. So this story, as I mentioned, sort of set this project in motion, and it made me really think about passing in more complex ways. And the first thing that I sort of began to realize was that historians perhaps have shied away from trying to write a history of passing because conventional wisdom tells us that it's really not possible for historians to write this kind of history because the people who passed did not leave a trace. So there's no evidence, there's no trace in the historical record. We think of passing as being something that literary critics or poets or playwrights or novelists would write about, but not something that that historians could write about. But I really believed that there was a history there, and that it was just sort of waiting to be told. So I went into the archives looking really for ghosts, looking for these traces and these pieces of evidence or bits of stories that I could sort of pull together to tell this history. And I was very surprised that there was quite a lot of evidence out there about this phenomenon, that this was much more common than I think most people might have assumed. I also found that we often think about passing as being a history of gain. So passing is often presented as a way to get ahead. It's often presented as a way to live in a better neighborhood, to have a better job, to have access to white-collar jobs that were certainly restricted to African Americans, particularly during the years of Jim Crow segregation. And then there were numerous social advantages to being white. Everything from being able to sit in a more comfortable seat in a movie theater to being referred to as Mr. or Mrs., which were more respectful titles that were reserved for white men and women only. So there's really been this sort of emphasis on passing as being a way of gaining, a way of enjoying certain advantages and enjoying a sense of dignity. And what I found was that there was quite a lot of loss that the people who passed experienced. So what my book tries to do is not so much to focus on the gains of passing, though I do certainly discuss them and try to contextualize them within each historical period that I examine, but I'm more interested in looking at what was lost by passing. So I'm more interested in looking at the family relationships, the friendships, the bonds, the ties, the shared memories, the jokes, and so much more. And this really, again, sort of came from hearing my aunt tell this story, because this is as much as we know, what I read to you. But you sort of imagine what it must have been like for this woman to hang up the phone with her mother and know that she would never see her father again, that she would not be able to go to his funeral, that she'd never see her mother again, that she'd never see her brothers and sisters again, that she'd never go to another Bud Billiken parade. So all of these losses that she experienced, we can only sort of imagine what those must have been like for her. So that was what I became very interested in, trying to kind of recreate and trying to find evidence of that, or mentions of that loss, that sense of loss in the historical record. And as I mentioned, I was very surprised that there was so much in the historical record that this sense of loss and this emotion of loss really permeated that evidence. So I begin the book in the late 18th century with stories of runaway slaves, and I take the story to the present. And I'm often asked, do people still pass today? And I think that, of course, people do, but certainly in very different ways than I talk about, particularly in the beginning eras of my book, given that we live in a much more multiracial society and in a society where mixed race identities are much more accepted now than they were in the period where I began. So I'm very interested in understanding and exploring how people who lived along the color line made sense of their racial identities over this 200-year period that I study. And I find this story to be both a comedy and also a tragedy, that there are very humorous stories of people who are able to sort of get over, who sort of delight in fooling white folks, to quote Langston Hughes, and who are very resourceful and have a lot of gumption, and see passing as a kind of practical joke at the expense of whites. But I also find it to be a tragedy, given the fact that there is so much loss that is experienced by those who make this decision. So what I really discovered in writing this book was that writing a history of passing is really writing a history of loss. So thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.